spring 1943. The Pacific Theater burned with a violence no training manual could prepare men for. Aboard American destroyers and cruisers, a peculiar ritual had begun spreading through the ranks. Sailors pulling on white hoods, long gloves, and covering every inch of exposed skin before battle stations. They called it anti-flash gear, and for weeks those who wore it endured endless mockery from those who did not. The fabric looked absurd. The hoods made men look like ghosts or surgical patients. Veterans laughed. New recruits whispered that it was for the afraid, the cautious, the weak. But deep in the engine rooms and ammunition handling spaces, a handful of engineers and medical officers knew something the mockers did not. When powder charges ignited, when hydraulic lines ruptured under enemy fire, the flash lasted less than a second, but it burned hot enough to melt human skin down to bone. No one believed it until it happened, and when it did, the laughter stopped forever. This is the story of a safety protocol dismissed as paranoia, a piece of cloth that separated the living from the dying, and the silence that fell over every mess hall when the survivors finally returned, faces covered, hands bandaged, voices gone. It is the story of men who mocked what they did not understand, and the moment when understanding came too late. Before we continue, subscribe and turn on the bell. Here we tell real untold stories of World War II, stories of survival, fear, and the fragile line between life and a flash of fire that no one sees coming. Chapter 1. The Ritual That Made Men Laugh. The first time the order came down, it sounded like a joke. April 1943, somewhere in the South Pacific, a destroyer preparing for patrol. The executive officer stood before the crew and held up a bundle of white fabric, hoods, gloves, long sleeves made of treated cotton. He explained in measured tones that from now on, all personnel at battle stations would wear full anti-flash protection. No exceptions. The room erupted in laughter. Men elbowed each other. Someone in the back shouted that they were being sent to war dressed like brides. Another asked if they were supposed to serve tea afterward. The officer did not smile. He repeated the order. Full coverage. Every man. Every station. And then he left. For days, the gear sat in lockers, untouched. The men had been through enough drills, enough false alarms, enough nights of meaningless preparation. They were already carrying gas masks they never used, life vests that felt like dead weight, helmets that clanged against low pipes. Now they were being told to add another layer of absurdity, fabric that made them sweat, hoods that limited peripheral vision, gloves that made handling ammunition slower and clumsier. In the cramped quarters below deck, the mockery became tradition. Veterans who had survived engagements without a scratch refused outright. They had been in the fire before. They had felt the heat of enemy shells landing close, the shudder of the hull absorbing impacts, and they had come through it fine. If the ship was going to take a hit, a hood was not going to save anyone. Better to move fast, stay sharp, and trust your instincts. The younger sailors watched and learned. If the experienced men were not wearing it, why should they? The gear became a symbol of fear, a badge of inexperience. To put it on was to admit you were afraid, and no one wanted to be the first to admit that. But in the ammunition handling rooms, where powder charges were stacked in narrow corridors, a few men quietly pulled the hoods over their heads. They did not announce it. They did not explain. They simply followed the order. And when their crewmates saw them, the jokes began again. Ghost crew, burn ward volunteers, men too scared to die like men. No one knew yet that the fabric was designed to reflect radiant heat, that it could absorb the first lethal wave of a flash fire long enough for a man to close his eyes, turn his face, and survive the half-second inferno that would otherwise strip the skin from his skull. No one knew, because no one had seen it happen. Not yet. The ship moved through its patrol route in silence. The sea stretched flat and endless. The air was thick with humidity and the smell of fuel oil. At night, men slept in shifts, their bodies pressed against bulkheads still warm from the day's sun. And in the dark, some of them wondered if the order had been serious, if someone, somewhere, knew something they did not. But in the morning the laughter returned, the hoods stayed in the lockers, and the ship sailed on, its crew divided between those who believed in rules and those who believed in luck. It would take only one engagement to teach them the difference. Chapter 2. The day the fire came. It began as a routine morning. Clear skies, calm water, the kind of day that made men forget they were at war. Breakfast was served in shifts. Coffee, powdered eggs, bread that tasted like cardboard. The usual complaints, the usual jokes. And then, just before 900 hours, the alarm sounded. General quarters. All hands to battle stations. The ship surged forward, engines roaring, the deck vibrating beneath boots as men scrambled into position. Gun crews loaded shells. Spotters climbed to their posts. Below deck, ammunition handlers began the careful choreography of moving powder charges from storage to the guns above. Some wore the hoods. Most did not. The enemy appeared on the horizon, a small convoy distant and blurred by heat shimmer. The engagement was brief. Shells exchanged. Smoke trails across the sky. The destroyer's guns barked in rhythm, each shot a coordinated pulse of fire and recoil. It should have been textbook. It should have been over in minutes. But something went wrong in the aft magazine. No one saw it happen. There was no warning. One moment, the handling crew was passing charges up the line, their movements synchronized and efficient. The next moment, a spark. Maybe static, maybe a faulty contact, maybe just the will of a universe that cared nothing for preparation, ignited a powder charge still in a sailor's hands. The flash lasted less than a second. It was not an explosion. It was a burst of radiant heat so intense that it turned the air itself into a weapon. The flame expanded outward in a hemisphere of white light, silent and absolute, and in that instant, every man within 10 feet was burned. Those without protection screamed immediately. Their faces blistered, their hands melted into the fabric of their uniforms, their eyes swelled shut. The skin on their necks and forearms turned black and peeled away in sheets. They fell to the deck, writhing, clawing at their own flesh, unable to understand what had just happened. But three men, three of the crew who had quietly worn the anti-flash gear despite the jokes, stood frozen in place, their vision intact, their skin protected beneath the white fabric. They had felt the heat, they had seen the flash, but they were still standing. For a moment, no one moved. The air smelled like burned meat and chemicals. The screaming continued, raw and endless. And the men in the hoods stared down at their hands, still covered, still whole, and realized they had just survived something their crewmates had not. The medics arrived within minutes, but there was little they could do. The burned men were carried topside, their faces wrapped in gauze, their voices reduced to whispers. Some would survive, some would not, but all of them would carry the scars for the rest of their lives. And below deck, in the narrow corridor where the flash had occurred, the survivors stood in silence, still wearing their hoods, and understood what the laughter had cost. Chapter 3. The Silence That Followed. The ship returned to port 3 days later. No flags, no ceremony, just the slow approach to the dock and the quiet transfer of the wounded to waiting ambulances. The crew stood on deck, watching the stretchers being carried down the gangway, and no one spoke. In the mess hall that night, the usual noise was gone. Men ate in silence, their eyes fixed on their trays. The veterans who had refused the gear sat with their heads down, their hands gripping forks too tightly. The younger sailors glanced around, uncertain, waiting for someone to say something that would make sense of what they had seen. But no one spoke, because there was nothing to say that would not sound like an accusation. The burned men had been their friends, their bunkmates, the ones who had laughed the loudest, and now they were gone, not dead but disfigured, their faces hidden beneath layers of bandages, their futures rewritten in a single second of fire, and the ones who had survived untouched were the ones who had been mocked. The executive officer returned to the crew 2 days later. He did not give a speech. He did not reprimand anyone. He simply walked through the compartments, made eye contact with each man, and placed a new bundle of anti-flash gear on every bunk. This time, no one laughed. Now tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and how far these forgotten wartime stories have reached. Your voice helps keep memory alive. Chapter 4. The Engineers Who Knew. Long before the flash, there had been warnings. Not from commanders or training officers, but from engineers, men who worked in shipyards, who studied metallurgy and thermodynamics, who understood what happened when confined spaces met rapid combustion. They had seen the tests. They had read the reports from earlier engagements in the Atlantic where British crews had suffered similar incidents, and they had tried to sound the alarm. But warnings are easy to ignore when they come from men in offices rather than men in combat. The anti-flash gear had been developed quietly, tested in laboratories far from the front lines. The fabric was treated with a flame-retardant solution. The design prioritized coverage over comfort. It was never meant to stop an explosion, only to give a man an extra half-second to react, to close his eyes, to turn away from the source of heat before it became lethal. The engineers had calculated the temperature of a powder flash. over 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, sustained for less than a second. Exposed skin would burn instantly, eyes would be blinded, airways would sear shut. But fabric, even thin, treated cotton, could reflect enough of that heat to make the difference between injury and death. They had submitted their findings to Naval Command. They had recommended mandatory use of the gear at all battle stations, and they had been met with resistance, not from malice, not from incompetence, but from the simple human belief that men who had already survived combat knew better than men who had only studied it. The veterans trusted their experience. The command trusted the veterans, and so the order went out as a recommendation, not a requirement. It took the first deaths to change that. After the incident, one of the engineers was brought aboard to inspect the damage. He walked through the aft magazine, stepping carefully over scorch marks on the deck, his hands tracing the paths the heat had taken. He measured temperatures. He photographed burn patterns, and when he was finished, he stood in the corridor where 3 men had survived and wrote a single sentence in his report: "The gear works. Compliance does not." His report was circulated quietly through the fleet. No announcements, no fanfare. Just a memo attached to supply orders. Anti-flash gear now mandatory at all battle stations. Non-compliance subject to disciplinary action. But the engineers knew that fear was a better teacher than orders, and fear had finally arrived. Chapter 5. The Burn Ward Visits. 2 weeks after the incident, a group of sailors from the same ship were granted shore leave. They were given an address, a naval hospital an hour inland, and told that some of their crewmates wanted to see them. They arrived in the afternoon, the sun high and unforgiving. The hospital was a low, sprawling building surrounded by palm trees and chain-link fences. Inside, the air was cool and antiseptic. A nurse led them down a hallway lined with closed doors, each one marked with a patient number and a diagnosis code. She stopped at the third door and knocked softly. A voice inside answered, hoarse, barely audible. She opened the door and gestured for them to enter. The man on the bed was unrecognizable. His face was wrapped in gauze, leaving only narrow slits for his eyes and mouth. His hands were bandaged to the wrists, the fingers immobilized. An IV drip fed into his arm. He turned his head slowly when they entered, and for a moment, no one knew what to say. One of the sailors stepped forward. He cleared his throat. He asked how the man was doing. The man on the bed did not answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was a whisper, each word shaped carefully around the pain. He said he was alive. That was all that mattered. But then he said something else. He said he had been one of the ones who laughed, that he had refused the gear because he thought it was for cowards, that he had believed experience was enough. And now, he said, he would never look the same again. His hands would never work the same again. His wife had written to say she was coming to see him, but he was not sure he wanted her to, because he did not know if she would recognize him, or if he would recognize himself. The sailors stood in silence. One of them, a younger man who had worn the hood that day, tried to say something comforting, but the burned man cut him off. He said there was nothing to say, that this was not about comfort. It was about memory, about making sure that no one else made the same mistake. He asked them to promise him something, to wear the gear, to follow the order, to never ever assume that fire would give them a second chance. They promised. And when they left the hospital, none of them spoke on the drive back. They sat in the back of the transport truck staring out at the passing landscape, each of them carrying the image of a man whose face was no longer his own. Chapter 6. The Shift in Command. The incident had not gone unnoticed at higher levels. Reports filtered up through the chain of command, accompanied by casualty lists and medical expenses. Admirals reviewed the findings. Boards of inquiry were convened, and a quiet consensus emerged. The anti-flash gear was no longer optional. Orders went out across the Pacific Fleet. Every ship, every crew, full compliance, effective immediately. Inspections would be conducted before every engagement. Any sailor found at a battle station without proper gear would face disciplinary action, not as punishment, but as protection, for himself, for his crewmates, for the mission. But the real shift came not from orders, but from the men themselves. On ships across the theater, veterans who had once mocked the gear now wore it without question. They did not explain their change of heart. They did not apologize. They simply pulled on the hoods, fastened the gloves, and took their positions. And when younger sailors asked why, the answer was always the same: because fire does not care how brave you are. In training sessions, instructors began using photographs from the burn wards. They showed recruits what happened when protocols were ignored. They explained the physics of radiant heat, the speed of combustion, the irreversible damage to human tissue, and they made it clear this was not about fear, it was about survival. The gear became standard, routine, unremarkable, and within months the jokes disappeared entirely. But the memory did not. If this story has moved you, leave a like. It helps others discover how humanity can survive even inside the walls of captivity. Chapter 7. The Letters Home. The burned sailors wrote letters home, though many struggled to hold a pen. Their families received envelopes marked with hospital stamps, the handwriting shaky and uneven. Inside, the words were careful, measured, designed to soften the truth without lying outright. One letter described the incident as an accident during routine operations. Another said the injuries were healing well, though it will take time. A third simply said, "I am alive and that is enough." But between the lines the families understood. They read the gaps. They noticed the things left unsaid, the absence of reassurance, the vague references to facial injuries, and limited mobility. And when they wrote back, their responses carried a new kind of fear. Not the fear of death, which they had already accepted, but the fear of a future reshaped by scars. Some wives asked practical questions. Would their husbands be able to return to work? Would they qualify for disability pay? Would the Navy cover the cost of reconstructive surgery? Others wrote with forced optimism, describing plans for after the war, promising that nothing would change, that love was stronger than appearance. But a few wrote with raw honesty. They admitted they were afraid of what they would see when their husbands finally came home, afraid that the man they married would be gone, replaced by someone they no longer recognized, afraid that their children would not understand. And the burned men, lying in hospital beds thousands of miles away, read those letters and felt the weight of survival. They had lived, but at what cost and for what? One sailor, a gunner's mate who had lost the use of his right hand, wrote back to his wife with a single question. "Would you still have married me if you had known this would happen?" Her response came 3 weeks later. It was short. It said, "I married you because I believed you would come home. And you did. That is all I ever asked for." He folded the letter carefully, tucked it beneath his pillow, and allowed himself to believe her. Chapter 8. The Survivors Who Remembered. Years after the war ended, a reunion was held for the crew of the destroyer. It was a small gathering, a rented hall in a coastal town, folding chairs arranged in uneven rows, a table with coffee and stale pastries. About 30 men attended. Some brought their families. Others came alone. The burned sailors were there, though not all of them. Some had chosen not to come, unwilling to relive the memories. But those who did arrive wore their scars openly. No hats, no scarves, just the faces they had carried for decades. Skin grafts, uneven pigmentation, the permanent marks of a fire that had lasted less than a second. The other survivors greeted them with quiet respect. There were no apologies, no explanations, just handshakes, embraces, and the shared understanding of men who had lived through the same moment from different sides of chance. During the event, someone suggested they take a group photograph. The men arranged themselves in rows, the burned sailors seated in front, the others standing behind. And before the camera clicked, one of the veterans, a man who had refused the gear that day, and survived only because he had been standing in the wrong place, stepped forward and placed his hand on the shoulder of a burned sailor beside him. He did not say anything. He did not need to. The gesture carried everything: gratitude, guilt, and the unspoken acknowledgement that survival was not a matter of courage, but of luck and a piece of white fabric. The photograph was developed a week later. It showed a group of old men, some scarred, some not, all standing together beneath a banner that read, USS, name redacted, Pacific Theater, 1943-1945. And on the back of the photograph, someone had written in faint pencil, the ones who wore the hoods, the ones who didn't, the ones who lived. Chapter 9. The Protocol That Became Memory. The anti-flash gear remained standard issue throughout the rest of the war and beyond. New sailors were trained to wear it without question. The mockery faded into history, replaced by routine compliance and institutional memory. And the engineers who had designed it moved on to other projects, their work validated by the lives it had saved. But the story itself, the flash, the burns, the laughter that had preceded tragedy, became something else. It became a lesson passed down through generations of naval personnel, told in training sessions and safety briefings, repeated in hushed tones by veterans who wanted younger sailors to understand that protocol was written in the scars of those who had ignored it. The burned sailors grew old. Some lived full lives. Others struggled with chronic pain, limited mobility, and the psychological weight of carrying disfigurement into a world that preferred not to look. But they did not speak of bitterness. When asked about the incident, they spoke instead of the men who had worn the gear, who had followed the order despite the jokes, and who had survived to tell the truth. And the truth was this: war does not forgive arrogance. Fire does not wait for belief. And survival, when it comes, is often the result of a single choice made in the face of mockery. A choice to trust the engineers over the veterans, to follow the protocol over instinct, to wear the absurd white hood and live. The war ended. The ships were decommissioned. The men scattered across the country, building lives in the shadow of what they had seen. But the memory remained, not as a triumph, but as a reminder that dignity and survival are not always found in courage, but in the quiet willingness to look foolish in order to stay alive. And in the archives of naval history, buried among casualty reports and equipment requisitions, a single notation remains: anti-flash gear, mandatory compliance effective immediately, non-negotiable. It was written in the language of bureaucracy, but those who had been there knew it was written in fire. Subscribe to our channel to uncover more hidden stories of World War II, stories of resilience, memory, and redemption. Thank you for watching.